She had one knife. She had sharpened it on a stone. It was not a surgical instrument. It was not even a good knife. But it was what she had, and so she sharpened it on a stone every morning at the start of her shift in a hospital that had no beds, no bandages, no drugs, no running water, and 32,000 patients. During the day, she worked for Josef Mengele. She did what he told her to do. She smiled where smiling was required. She carried out her official duties in the women's camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau with the controlled, careful movements of a doctor who understood that any wrong step would not just end her life. It would end her ability to help the women around her. At night, she worked against him. In the dark corners of the barracks, on dirty floors, in latrine stalls, using only her hands, she performed procedures that would have been unthinkable to her before the war. She performed them in silence. She performed them in secret. She performed them knowing that if the guards discovered what she was doing, she would be killed. Her name was Dr. Gisella Perl. She was a Hungarian Jewish gynecologist. She was, before the war, one of the most respected physicians in her city. She delivered babies. She cared for women. She believed in the sanctity of life with the double conviction of a doctor and an observant Jew. Auschwitz forced her to redefine what saving life actually meant. And before I tell you what she chose and what it cost her, subscribe to this channel. Because Dr. Gisella Perl is not a name that appears in most history books. She should be in all of them. There is a moment Gisella Perl describes in her 1948 memoir that I keep returning to. She is home in Săiatu Marmația in the Carpathian foothills of Hungary. It is an evening before the war. Her son is playing violin. The music moves through the rooms of their house. She is a doctor. Her husband Ephraim is a doctor. They have 2 children, a practice, a life. The evening is ordinary, and its ordinariness is the point. She wrote the memoir 3 years after Auschwitz. She wrote that violin passage because she needed whoever was reading to understand what the camp had replaced. Gisella Perl was born on December 10, 1907, in Săiatu Marmația, a city that was part of Hungary when she was born, part of Romania after 1920, and would briefly return to Hungarian control during the war. Her father Morris was deeply observant and initially refused to allow her to pursue medicine, fearing that it would pull her away from Judaism. She persuaded him otherwise, promising to remain observant. She kept that promise her entire life. In 1923, at the age of 16, she graduated first in her secondary school class. She was the only woman in that class. She was the only Jew. She went on to study medicine, eventually in Berlin, and trained as a gynecologist. She returned to Hungary in 1933 when the Nazi Party's rise began stripping Jewish doctors of their positions and pushing them out of German universities. She and her husband Ephraim set up their practice in Săiatu. She delivered babies. She cared for women across the region. She was, by all accounts that survive, beloved. Hungary was different from the rest of occupied Europe for a long time. Hungary was an ally of Germany rather than an occupied territory. The Hungarian Jewish community, approximately 800,000 people, was the largest remaining Jewish population in Europe that had not yet been deported as late as 1944. There was a widespread and understandable belief among Hungarian Jews that they were somehow insulated, somehow different, somehow protected by their nation's diplomatic relationship with Berlin. March 19, 1944 ended that belief. Germany invaded and occupied Hungary on that date, and the deportations began within weeks, the most rapid mass deportation of the entire Holocaust. In less than 2 months, approximately 437,000 Hungarian Jews were loaded onto trains and sent to Auschwitz. More than 3/4 of them were dead within hours of arrival. Gisella Perl did one thing before she was taken. She found a non-Jewish family who would hide her daughter Gabriella. She arranged the hiding. She kissed her daughter goodbye. She did not know if she would ever see her again. Then she climbed into a cattle car with her husband, her son, her parents, and what remained of her extended family. The journey lasted 8 days. The car doors opened at Auschwitz-Birkenau in May 1944. The first thing Perl records in her memoir about the arrival is the smell, and then the light, and then the separation, the immediate, violent sorting of families who had traveled together for 8 days and were now being pulled apart in seconds. There was no time to understand what was happening. There was barely time to look. On the ramp, an SS doctor was directing the selections. He was deciding, with a glance and a gesture, who went left and who went right. Those who went right would be assigned to forced labor. Those who went left, the elderly, the children, anyone who appeared weak or unwell, pregnant women, mothers with small children, would be dead within hours. Perl recognized the SS doctor giving the orders. His name was Dr. Victor Capsius. He had been a pharmaceutical representative before the war. He and his products had called on Gisella and Ephraim's practice. They had hosted him for dinner in their home in Saitu in 1943. She had served him food at her table. She had not known, or perhaps not let herself believe, what he was. He was now selecting her family for death or survival. Perl was pulled to the right, forced labor, survival for the moment. Her parents went the other way. Her son went the other way. She watched it happen. She records it in her memoir without elaboration, just the fact of it, stated cleanly, because the fact itself is enough. Of the approximately 10,000 to 12,000 Jews on Perl's transport, roughly 3,000 were selected for forced labor. The remaining 7,000 to 9,000 were gassed that day. Shortly after arrival, an announcement was made in the women's section. Any prisoner who had been a doctor before the war should step forward. Gisella Perl stepped forward. She understood that identifying herself as a physician might mean being recruited for Mengel's experiments. She also understood that not identifying herself made survival significantly less likely. She stepped forward. This decision, this single step, is what kept her alive. Jewish doctors at Auschwitz survived at roughly 10 times the rate of other prisoners selected for labor. They were valuable. They were granted marginally better food, marginally cleaner sleeping conditions, and a role that was, under the camp's logic, essential. It was not mercy, it was utility. She was assigned to help establish a hospital in the women's labor camp, Camp C, designated for female slave laborers. She was one of 5 prisoner doctors and a handful of nurses given this task. They were responsible for the welfare of approximately 32,000 women. The hospital had no beds, no bandages, no drugs, no instruments, no running water, no antiseptic. Gisella Perl had one knife. She sharpened it on a stone. Let me tell you what a day looked like. She swept the hospital floor with her hands each morning, because the Nazis required the facility to be kept meticulously clean, and there were no brooms. Any evidence of dirt or disorder would result in a beating or something worse. So she swept with her hands. Then she began seeing patients. 32,000 women, starvation, typhus, pneumonia, wounds from guard beatings, lacerations deep enough to infect across the back, the arms, the face, broken ribs that needed tapping, teeth that needed extracting, bones fractured by the kind of casual violence that the guards dispensed without record or consequence. Gisella Perl set broken bones without anesthetic. She cleaned wounds with whatever she could find, occasionally a paper bandage, mostly nothing at all. She performed breast surgeries on women whose bodies had been deliberately lacerated by whips, surgeries that left deep infections, using only that one sharpened knife. She wrote later, I treated patients with my voice, telling them beautiful stories, telling them that one day we would have birthdays again, that one day we would sing again. The voice was often the only medicine available. Then there was the blood. One of Perl's early assigned duties was to participate in what the SS called blood donations from Jewish prisoners, blood extracted for use by the German military. She entered Block VII, and found approximately 600 panic-stricken women in cages along the walls and lying on the ground. SS men moved through the room with large needles, extracting blood from bodies that were already severely malnourished and barely sustaining themselves. Perl describes rivers of blood on the floor around the women who had collapsed. She writes about the sound of the room, the strained breathing, the near-inaudible pulses. When the SS demanded blood samples from her hospital patients to screen for infectious disease, knowing that any patient revealed to have typhus would be removed and killed, Perl and her colleagues made a quiet, dangerous decision. They submitted their own blood instead of their patients, their own arms, their own veins, to cover for the dying women in their care. There is no record of how many times they did this, only that they did. And then came the order from Mengele. Dr. Josef Mengele discovered that Perl was a trained gynecologist. He called her in and gave her a direct instruction. It was her duty, he said, to report every pregnant woman in the camp to him personally. He told her what would happen to them. They would be sent to a special camp with better nutrition. They would receive extra bread, even milk. Gisella Perl records in her memoir what happened when women heard this. They began approaching Mengele directly, reporting themselves. "I am pregnant." They did it in hope. The promise of food and milk and better conditions in a place where starvation was the baseline was enough to make a pregnant woman identify herself to the man with the power of life and death. Perl describes finding out the truth. The women who reported their pregnancies were not sent to a special camp. They were taken to Mengele's research block. They were subjected to experiments. Then both they and their unborn children were killed and disposed of in the crematorium. She writes, "I decided that never again would there be a pregnant woman in Auschwitz." Understand what that decision required. Gisella Perl was an observant Jewish woman who had built her medical career on bringing life into the world. She had spent years delivering babies in situ. Her religious convictions and her professional convictions ran in the same direction. Life was sacred. Life was to be protected. What Mengele was doing to pregnancy was an abomination, and what she was about to do in response to it was something that, in any other context, she would have considered equally unthinkable. She began performing abortions. At night, in the dark, in the barracks, in latrine stalls, in whatever private space she could find, with no instruments, no anesthetic, no antiseptic, no running water, using only her hands. For pregnancies too advanced for abortion, she manually induced premature delivery. She did this in absolute secrecy, because if the SS discovered what she was doing, she would be killed. She did this while spending her days working visibly, under Mengele's oversight, carrying out her official duties in the hospital, maintaining the appearance of compliance that her survival required. She split her existence completely in two. The prisoner doctor the SS believed they controlled, and the woman working against them in the dark. She estimated she performed hundreds of these procedures during her time in Auschwitz. She wrote, "No one will ever know what it meant to me to destroy those bobbies, but if I had not done it, both mother and child would have been cruelly murdered." There is no cleaner summary of what Auschwitz did to the concept of medical ethics. There is no better demonstration of the impossible position the camp placed Jewish prisoner physicians in. Mengele had handed her a role, gynecologist, that he intended to use as a surveillance instrument, a means of identifying pregnant women for his experiments. She took that same role and turned it into its opposite. She used the authority the camp had given her as a doctor to systematically undermine the camp's own directives, every night, with her bare hands, in the dark. On days when she learned in advance that the SS would clear the hospital ward to send the sickest patients to the gas chambers, she smuggled patients out, sent them back to their barracks before the selection arrived, so they would not be present for it. She could not save all of them. She saved some. While Gisella Perl worked her way through that first year in Auschwitz, her family was being destroyed around her. Her son, separated from her on the ramp at arrival, was killed in the gas chambers. Her parents perished in the extermination camps. Her husband Ephraim survived Auschwitz. He was still alive as the Soviet Red Army advanced on the camp in January 1945, and the SS began evacuating prisoners. He was beaten to death by guards in the final days before liberation. Ephraim Cross, the surgeon who had practiced beside his wife in Saitu, who had listened to his son play violin in their house by the Carpathian Mountains, survived everything the camp had done to him for months, and was killed by a guard who had decided, in the last days of a war that was already decided, to do it anyway. Perl was moved from Auschwitz before liberation, not on the death march that killed tens of thousands in the winter of 1945, but transferred by the SS to a subcamp near Hamburg, and eventually to Bergen-Belsen, where she was liberated in April 1945. She learned about Ephraim shortly after liberation. She did not know about her daughter Gabriella. She did not know if the hiding had worked. She would not know for 34 years. What she knew in the spring of 1945 was this: her son was dead. Her husband was dead. Her parents were dead. She had spent months in Auschwitz performing procedures that violated everything she had been trained to believe was sacred, in order to save women who, many of them, died anyway. She had watched the SS drag patients from her hospital and send them to the crematorium on days when she was not fast enough to get them out first. She had submitted her own blood to cover for patients who would be killed if their illness was discovered. She had operated with a knife she sharpened on a stone. And none of it had been enough to save the people she loved most. In 1947, Gisella Perl attempted suicide. She poisoned herself. She was found before she died. She was taken to a convent in France to recover. The nuns cared for her. She did not speak publicly about what had driven her to it. She did not need to. In March 1947, Perl arrived in New York City on a temporary visa, sponsored by the Hungarian Jewish Appeal and the United Jewish Appeal, to lecture about her experiences. She was not received as a hero. The U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service interrogated her on suspicion of having assisted Nazi doctors in carrying out human rights abuses at Auschwitz. The concern was her proximity to Mengele's operations. She had worked alongside him, officially. She had carried out duties assigned by him. The investigation could not yet see, from the outside, what those duties had been and what she had done underneath them. She was saved by the women she had saved. Survivor testimony cleared her. One woman, identified only as Ms. B in documents submitted to the Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany, stated formally, "Without Dr. Perl's medical knowledge and willingness to risk her life by helping us, it would be impossible to know what would have happened to me and to many other female prisoners. She was the doctor of the Jews." That phrase, the doctor of the Jews, had been what the women in Camp C called her at night, in Yiddish, as she moved through the barracks with her bare hands. "Gissi Doctor." It was an endearment and a testimony, and in the end, the legal document that determined she was not a collaborator but something closer to the opposite. Her testimony at the Auschwitz trial also helped convict an SS doctor for his crimes at the camp. The woman who had been interrogated as a suspected perpetrator became a witness for the prosecution. On March 12, 1948, President Harry Truman signed a bill sponsored by New York Representative Saul Bloom, allowing Perl to remain in the United States as a permanent resident. Eleanor Roosevelt had met her, lunched with her, and encouraged her to resume practicing medicine. Perl took that advice. She joined Mount Sinai Hospital in New York as the only female physician in the labor and delivery department. She became a specialist in infertility. Her patients, many of them, were survivors she had known in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, women whose bodies had been damaged by the camp, who had been told they could never have children, who came to a doctor on Park Avenue who had once operated on them with a knife sharpened on a stone. She had the lowest earning practice on Park Avenue. She had the most significant one. She told the New York Times in 1982, "I was the poorest doctor on Park Avenue, but I had the greatest practice. All of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen were my patients." Every time she entered the delivery room, every single time, for the decades she practiced, she paused before beginning and said the same prayer. She had said it the first time she delivered a baby after the war, and she said it at every delivery until she retired. "God, you owe me a life, a living baby." In 1978, Gisella Perl was giving a lecture about her experiences. Someone in the audience approached her afterward with information. Her daughter Gabriella, hidden with a non-Jewish family in 1944, before the cattle cars, before the ramp, before all of it, was alive. She had survived the war. She had built a life. She was living in Israel. Gisella Perl had not known for 34 years. In 1979, she moved to Herzliya, Israel, to be reunited with Gabriella and with the grandson she had never met. She had made a vow when her cattle car entered the gates of Auschwitz in 1944. Her husband and her father had held her and said, "We will meet someday in Jerusalem." Her husband and father did not survive to keep that promise. She kept it for them. She volunteered at the obstetrics clinic at Shar Zedek Medical Center in Jerusalem. She continued attending deliveries. She continued saying the same prayer. She died on December 16, 1988 in Herzliya, 6 days after her 81st birthday. Her memoir, I Was a Doctor in Auschwitz, published in 1948, remains in print. The Emmy Award-winning film Out of the Ashes, starring Christine Lottie, was released in 2003 and brought her story to a wider audience. The knife is not in any archive, no one thought to preserve it, but the women she saved with it lived. Many of them had children. Some of those children have children now. I want to sit with something before we close. There is a version of Gisella Perl's story that centers on the abortions, on the impossible moral calculation she made and what it cost her in terms of her own beliefs, her religious identity, her sense of herself as a healer. That version is real and it matters. She never stopped carrying the weight of those decisions. She said so explicitly, in her memoir and in interviews, for the rest of her life. But I think there is something else in this story that deserves to be named. Mengele gave Gisella Perl a role. He gave her that role because he believed she would serve his purposes. He assigned her to gynecology in the women's camp because a Jewish gynecologist was useful to him, useful for identifying pregnancies, useful for maintaining the labor force's productivity, useful for the institutional machinery of the camp. He saw a tool. He handed her a position. She used it against him. Every single night, from the moment she understood what was happening to the women who reported their pregnancies to him, she used the authority the camp had given her as a doctor to undermine the camp. She submitted her own blood to protect typhus patients. She smuggled the sickest women out of the hospital before the selection arrived. She performed procedures in the dark that made the women around her invisible to the mechanism designed to kill them. She was not a Judenrat member making political compromises. She was not a capo maintaining order for the SS. She was a prisoner with one knife, sharpened on a stone, conducting a systematic campaign of medical resistance inside the most lethal institution the 20th century produced, using the authority her captor had handed her as a weapon against everything he stood for. And she was interrogated for it when the war ended. The United States immigration system looked at a woman who had spent 8 months working alongside Mengele and could not initially determine whether she was a collaborator or a resistor. That failure of recognition, the inability of a peacetime institution to see clearly what survival had required, is its own kind of historical indictment. She was saved, in the end, not by a government process, but by the testimony of the women she had saved in the dark. She was the doctor of the Jews. That is what they called her, at night in Yiddish in the barracks of Auschwitz. Not every act of resistance was a gun. Not every hero wore a uniform. Some resistance looked like a woman sharpening a knife on a stone, and walking into the dark with her bare hands and doing the only thing available to her that saved a life. Dr. Gisella Perl saved hundreds of women at Auschwitz. She delivered approximately 3,000 babies after the war. She spent 40 years giving life back to women whose bodies the camp had tried to make permanently incapable of it. Every time she entered a delivery room, she said the same prayer. God, you owe me a life. He paid. Never again.